Who created the world? Stop for a moment and imagine the answers that immediately rise. An old man with a long beard, a microscopic fluctuation in a pre-Big Bang foam, a distant designer running a cosmic workshop, or some advanced extraterrestrial intelligence that engineered us like a laboratory experiment. Each of those images carries a story about where we stand, made by someone else, indefinite and separate from the source, observed rather than the observer. For most of my life, those competing stories felt exhaustive. Then a single night in a small English town forced everything I thought I knew into a new frame, a frame a luminous stranger walked me through, wordlessly, and whose demonstration resonated with things mystics had whispered across continents and millennia. Professor Alan Mitchell had spent 35 years with books as his companions, not as a bibliophile's hoarding of rare covers, but as a scholar who had trained his gaze to find patterns across centuries and languages. He read Sufi sheikhs in translation on mornings when his students filed into his seminar on comparative mysticism. He thumbed through medieval Latin manuscripts at the university archive in the afternoons. On winter evenings, he would place a battered copy of the Upanishads beside a slim modern monograph on consciousness studies and stare at them until the margins blurred. Over decades, a single, unsettling pattern returned like an echo. In texts separated by geography and religion, those who described the deepest encounters called the sense of separation an illusion. They spoke in different metaphors: an ocean and its waves, a lamp and its flame, a mirror and its reflection. But the core report was curiously the same: the perceiver and the perceived are not ultimately two. Alan wrote articles. He wrote essays that tried to bridge the polite skepticism of the academy with a certain humility about inner experience. He published a book that asked, as openly as an academic could, whether the dominant materialist model of mind had become a kind of secular theology that refused to admit alternative evidences. It won a small, respectful following among those already inclined to such questions, and then, predictably, it was ignored by many of his peers. Reviewers called it speculative, the grant committees called it methodologically risky, and tenure boards preferred safer lines, predictable paradigms, measured progress. He learned the patient indignity of marginalization that comes not from a single attack, but from the slow withdrawal of attention. Behind the professional frustrations, there was a quieter sorrow. Alan had watched students come into his office with crises of meaning, bright, capable people who felt morally adrift in a world that offered either anemic conformism or brittle cynicism.
He had listened to older colleagues defend interpretive traditions as though scholarship were a kind of repair shop, and he had sat and argued, always trying to keep his language careful. Mystical testimony is not the same as doctrinal proof. Personal encounter is not universal declaration. Yet the deeper he read, the more he felt that the patterns pointed to an experiential reality that institutions sometimes had reasons to domesticate. Mystics who spoke of unity were often silenced. Canonized words were pared down into dogma that smoothed their edges, and the living heat of experience was converted into settled propositions. On a narrow street lined with plane trees and the indifferent hum of suburbia, Alan kept a small house with a study that could have been mistaken for a map of his mind. Shelves lined in uneven rows, thumb-worn translations of the Gospel of Thomas on the same plane as radical treatises by early Gnostic thinkers, stacks of journals on neurophenomenology, and the occasional controversial paper by Rupert Sheldrake tucked next to medieval sermons. There were notes pinned to corkboards where he tried to keep the strands of centuries from tangling into platitudes. He would sometimes fall asleep at his desk, head on his hands, and wake to the smell of coffee and the lamplight haloing the spines like an audience. It was in that house, a week that began with the petty irritation of academic rejection, that the ordinary bent of his life, papers, pedagogy, the small, relentless consumption of things to say, fractured. The evening was cool, a wet sheen lay in the street. He had left a draft with a promising publisher and was waiting for an answer that did not arrive. The kind of uncertainty that in a younger man would have bent into anger now visited him in the form of weary resignation. He stepped into the backyard because the night air felt like a change of subject. The light came first, not as a blaze but as a subtle chromatic shift, the palette of the world rearranging itself into cooler blue golds. At first, Alan thought of a car's headlamps, then the reflection of a street lamp in the wet cobbles. Then, when the light resolved into slow motion and a shape above the hedgerow, he knew none of his usual categories fit. There was no roar, no cinematic wind. The sound was interior, a soft vibration like the sense one gets when a low singing bowl is struck in a vast hall. Instead of fear, the first sensation was a focused attention, an invitation to be present in a way that felt like an ethical demand rather than a thrill. The being that stepped from that light was not a cartoon of alienhood. It had features that did not align neatly with any human race: elongated face, eyes that seemed to hold motion rather than reflect, skin that had a faint translucency. It moved with practical deliberation, not theatricality. When it approached, it did not speak aloud.
Instead, Alan found himself flooded with images, feelings, and a texture of meaning that arrived as if someone had tuned an inner dial. The contact was telepathic in the sense that a thought was given a voiceless language and immediately recognized. It was neutral, devoid of evangelizing heat and also of sterile curiosity. Its first communication was simple, a quiet, clear impression that whatever had been working in Alan's books for 35 years was not merely fanciful. "You have seen the pattern," the impression said, not through words, but as a coherent constellation of understanding. Show not by argument, but by demonstration. Alan was the kind of man who could catalog the miracles of literary history with precise dates and contingencies. Yet the manner of that demonstration, a showing rather than telling, pressed on a deeper, vulnerable mechanism. He hesitated. The part of him trained to assess risk calibrated the possible threats. The part of him that had stood in monasteries and remembered the silence knew that some truths cannot be inspected with instruments alone. He accepted, not because he trusted an unknown intelligence, but because there was a certain confluence of motives: curiosity, a lifetime of patterns, and a tired hope that the universe might still contain honest surprises. He was invited aboard. The interior of the craft was not the chrome scientific cliché on late-night television, but an architecture of gentle curves and surfaces that seemed to hum with a density of attention rather than with machinery. Light was not only visible, it had a texture that seemed to carry meaning, soft gradients that felt like a language of tone. There were no instruments that looked like ours. Where he expected panels and buttons, there were membranes that responded to intent and attention, as if the ship itself were a living apparatus of awareness. The being guided him to a circular space that could have been a room or a threshold of perception. There, more explicitly than the initial contact had allowed, the alien conducted the demonstration. It did not lecture, it projected, if that is even the right word, a sequence of inner images into Alan's mind, images not colored by words but by sensations. They opened like a book without pages. First, there was the ocean, vast and simple. Alan had read the ocean as a metaphor in many mystical texts. Suddenly he was no longer reading a metaphor but participating in it. He felt the rhythm of tides, the push of watery mass, the smallness of wave crests against an immense continuity. Yet the ocean was not out him. He was the wave, the water, and the current. The image rearranged his sense so that the idea of a discrete observer dropped like a stage prop. Then the veil, the classic image of a film between a lamp and a light-seeking eye, unfurled.
Where once the world had been an array of objects, it became as if a million small screens were suspended in a dark theater, each screen holding a fragment of luminous experience. The alien directed his attention to one of these screens: a child laughing in a market, a comet trailing through cold space, a surgeon's hands tensing with the responsibility of a life in their care. Each scene was complete and vivid, and at the same time, Alan could feel the connective tissue, an indefinable substrate that made them possible. The feeling was less the vision of a single author and more the taste of a shared handwriting. Gradually, the demonstration tightened. The alien suggested, again without speaking, that the process of creation could be understood as a deliberate fragmentation, a veiling of a more extensive field into discrete experiential loci. Like a single ocean generating infinite waves to experience itself as a multiplicity, the one allowed itself to be many in order to taste being from countless points of view. This was not presented as a metaphysical categorization imposed from outside. It arrived as a clinical experiential fact in Alan's mind. He could feel the logic of it and the ethical consequence, the implication that if the wave is the ocean and the ocean is the wave, then harm to the wave is harm to the ocean. But the demonstration did not stop at metaphor. The alien showed Alan what felt like the mechanics of forgetting. Something like a veil, thin at first, then thicker, was drawn across the membranes of awareness. Attention was narrowed, memory was partitioned. From the unified substrate, localized centers of experience formed and were given narratives, histories, identities, likes and dislikes, the biological machinery that allowed a perspective to endure. The process was neither cruel nor random. It had an intelligence that allowed for surprise, learning, and the drama of discovery. The alien's clarity was chilling in its economy. The veiling was a functional compromise that allowed the one to have the thrill of discovery by not knowing itself completely.
As Alan moved through these images, his trained analytical mind tried to name the phenomenon in literature. He remembered al-Hallaj's cry of being one with the beloved, and how that proclamation had roused both ecstasy and the wrath of institutions. He thought of Meister Eckhart's language about the ground beyond self and God, phrased in sermons and metaphors that were later contorted by theological committees. He caught the faint outline of the words of certain Upanishadic seers who insisted that the Atman was identical with Brahman, a statement often translated into neat metaphysical claims, but here reappearing as a lived calibration of perception.
Each recollection in his mind was like a breadcrumb, and the alien was not lecturing about texts. It was lining those breadcrumbs up next to the lived event, as if to say, see how these testimonies are not isolated, they are maps of the same territory. Even so, Alan's mind resisted in ways he had been pre-warned to expect in seminars. There was the academic reflex that needed objectivity. How is one to verify inner states? There was skepticism about anthropomorphizing a non-human intelligence into a mystical teacher. There was also the older fear. What would happen if such an insight became popular beyond the careful framing he had tried to maintain? He could imagine institutions, whether religious or scientific, reacting defensively, canonizing a softened version of the insight in order to domesticate it, ridiculing it into oblivion as fanciful, or absorbing it in jargon that sterilized its ethical sting. The alien seemed to anticipate these countermoves, but did not provide solutions. It offered demonstration, not institutional strategy. There was another layer to the showing that no abstract metaphor could capture, the sense of ethical gravity. The revelation that the separation is an artifact of a deliberate veiling did not absolve moral responsibility. Rather, it resurfaced responsibility in a more intimate register. If every isolated point of view is a transient manifestation of a shared ground, then when one wave injures another, it is an injury within the same body. The alien's presentation made the link between ontology and ethics almost unavoidable. Alan felt the weight of that bridge like a hand on his chest. At times during the demonstration, the alien allowed Alan to look at himself in multiple frames simultaneously. He saw his past as a student arguing about doctrine in a cold conference hall. He saw past mystics enduring persecution with a fierce tenderness. He saw future possible lines, students who might pick up the thread and be helped by it or not. The multiplicity of perspectives created an experiential echolalia. Each view was as valid and as provisional as the others, each adding to the perception of a whole. He could taste humility and possibility at once. The two were not exclusive. The ship did not rely on human language to point out historical examples, but as Alan's mind worked to make sense of the vision, names surfaced with the clarity of memory. He could see al-Hallaj's public ecstasies and the violent reaction they provoked. He could sense the austere compassion of St. John of the Cross and the poetic austerity with which he described the dark night. He remembered passages from the Gospel of Thomas, fragments that were often marginalized, and the way certain Gnostic texts had been exiled or buried. He thought of the Brahmanic control of Vedic knowledge in ancient times and the way the Upanishadic seers passed on esoteric insights in guarded settings.
The pattern of suppression, absorption, or misinterpretation formed itself in his mind like a cartography of institutional inertia. It was here that the alien's neutrality became most evident. It neither condemned nor praised the institutions that had, across time, constrained these expressions. Instead, the demonstration seemed to suggest mechanisms. When an insight threatens a social order dependent on difference, priests needing congregations, scholars needing paradigms, those systems tend to recode experience into doctrine, to bind living insights into categories that serve organizational coherence. Likewise, an institutional zeal for objectivity in science can operate as a different form of domestication. Phenomena that do not fit the reigning model are labeled anomalies and relegated to margins until they vanish from mainstream concern. The alien did not rail against these tendencies. It simply slid the mechanisms into view so Alan could see how something important might be systematically obscured. At one point, the ship allowed him to witness a small vignette of institutional response without judgment. He watched a composite scene, a council in a dim hall, words spoken in measured tones, an edict forming, and felt the microdynamics of fear and pragmatism. The council's action was not evil. It was, structurally, a homeostatic move, an attempt to preserve a system. This was a relief in its own way. The alien's demonstration refused binary moralization. The purpose was to illuminate, not to indict. Yet illumination itself can be revolutionary. For Alan, the sight of these patterns operating across time, councils, inquisitions, academic committees, the slow drawing of lines that exclude felt like a confirmation that something more than coincidence was at work. Even as he absorbed the ship's images, Alan's internal critic would not be fully quiet. He tested every impression for fallibility. Did he want the revelation because it soothed aches? Was he, despite his training, imposing patterns where none must be? He had taught students how to read mystical language with skepticism and charity. Now that role reversed into the studenthood of his own inner life. This oscillation between receptivity and critique felt like an essential hygiene rather than a handicap. The alien's demonstration had not aimed to dissolve any critical faculty. It had aimed to show the living phenomenon that had underwritten centuries of first-person testimony. Time inside the craft did not proceed according to ordinary calendars. What might have been minutes stretched and contracted, memory telescoped. The alien displayed in compact sequences what looked like a developmental arc of consciousness, a field noticing itself, attention differentiating, the emergence of a story, the cultivation of forgetting as a skill to increase the novelty of experience.
There was an apparent intelligence behind the process that treated multiplicity as both a risk to lose the source and an opportunity for discovery. The alien showing implied that not all forgetting was accidental. Some of it was a strategy to allow new flavors of being to arrive. When Alan's attention returned to the concrete, the craft's interior softened back toward ordinary perception. The alien hovered nearby, its presence now familiar rather than uncanny. It communicated a final impression in that segment. Knowing is less important than recognizing. Knowledge, as a set of propositions, could be cataloged and debated. Recognition was an embodied shift. It was the difference between reading about the ocean and being a wave. The alien did not scold the practice of knowledge. It simply suggested that the lived route to ethical transformation ran through recognition. As the craft's doorway hummed open and the night air of his backyard breathed back into him, Alan stepped down feeling like a man who had been taught a new grammar for the same language. He could name parts of the experience in the scholarly categories he inhabited, non-duality, panentheism, mystical union, but the weight and texture of the demonstration eluded full capture in academic prose. The phenomenon had the clarity of an event and the complexity of an entire research program. He had been shown, not told. That night, sleep was porous. Images from the craft threaded into the small, ordinary perceptions of domestic life. The kettle's whistle sounded like the ship's interior hum. The pattern of rain against the window echoed the ocean image. A student's distant email requesting a reference became, in his mind, a tiny screen in the Hall of Veils. He woke with a careful exhilaration, no wild certainty, but the heavy feeling of someone carrying a fragile, luminous object back into daylight. In the days that followed, Alan became both architect and test subject to his own retelling. He tried to write down what had been shown, aware of the inevitable loss in translation from a living demonstration to a linear argument. His notes alternated between technical observations, how the telepathic contact felt, the sequence of images, and more tentative reflections about the ethical consequences. He met with a few close colleagues who owed him trust. He described the experience with all the academic caution he could summon. Some responded with polite curiosity, others with guarded incredulity. The pattern of reception was itself a lesson. People often hear what their frameworks allow them to hear. There was a temptation to present the encounter as a definitive answer to the title's question, who created the world? But part of Alan's training pushed back. The alien's demonstration, for all its clarity, had not asserted a single monolithic doctrine. It had shown a mechanism, an experiential economy in which a more extensive consciousness could allow itself to be many in order to taste itself.
The implication was startling. The category of creator as an external, separate being was only one of many possible metaphors. Equally honest within the experience was the idea that creation arises from a dynamics of self-awareness and veiling. Yet he knew that to present that as a metaphysical law would be to do the very thing the demonstration had refused, reduce living experience into rigid propositions. So Alan set out a different task for himself, to treat the alien's visit as a corroboration of a pattern he had already been tracking in texts and testimonies. He would build a bridge between lived demonstration and historical testimony, rather than a manifesto that replaced centuries of theology.
Somewhere between the ship's showing and his own notebooks, an approach formed. Collect the experiential reports, map the institutional responses, and design practices that allowed individuals to test recognition for themselves. The goal was not conversion, but invitation, an offering of means to look honestly at one's own perception. At the end of the first week, he chose a small seminar group, graduate students who had shown a capacity for both critical rigor and reflective practice. He told them, carefully, that he had had an unusual experience, and that he would present it honestly. The conversation that followed was as messy and humane as any good seminar ought to be. Some students were intrigued, others worried it leaned too close to the spiritual for a secular classroom. One woman raised the obvious objection: if everything is one and the separation is illusory, does responsibility dissolve? Alan listened, then relayed the ship's quiet answer: recognition and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. To see unity is to be more accountable to the suffering of the parts. It was a statement that invited more practice than argument. For Alan, the aftershocks of the encounter were not only intellectual but existential. He found his old habits, habitual defensiveness, the urge to frame mystical claims in citations, softening. He began to practice small pauses during the day, not as a ritual promising enlightenment, but as a method of calibration. Standing at a crosswalk, he would pause for a breath and notice the thin membrane of self that made the difference between me and that. He would look into the face of a bus driver and try, without theatricality, to sense the shared substrate that might underlie both their personhoods. These were tentative experiments, not guaranteed routes to revelation. Some were merely curiosities, some carried a profound tenderness. The memory of the ship and of the alien's neutral validation became a central hinge for his next moves.
He realized two things with unsettling clarity. First, that his long thread of research, those scattered notes on Eckhart, the passages from the Gospel of Thomas, the marginalia on the Upanishads, were not the eccentricities of a private scholar, but fragments of a wider human testimony. Second, that the institutional frameworks he had always critiqued were not malevolent conspirators, but systems with tremendous inertia that could, by inattention, erase vital knowledge. As he prepared to share more honestly with a wider audience, Alan felt the old fear. How would churches react? How would universities treat his testimony? Could an alien's demonstration be translated into public discourse without being flattened into caricature? He had to craft not a proclamation, but a conversation, one that preserved the experiential core and invited scrutiny. On a gray afternoon, as he walked the campus quadrangle, students passing with headphones and intent, Alan took out his notebook and began to sketch the scaffolding for an essay. He would start with the question that still seemed to shape the world: who created the world? He would outline the conventional answers and then present the alien as a validating instance, an event that had shown a kinematic, the one veiling itself into multiplicity to taste experience. He would not claim universality. He would not convert the experience into a dogma. He would, instead, offer a triple path: the report, the historical corroboration, and the provisional practices for those willing to test recognition for themselves. But even as he drafted the opening lines, the edges of his plan hardened into new kinds of risk. There were practical dangers in publicizing such testimony: misinterpretation, sensational headlines, the flattening of a lived demonstration into clickbait slogans. He imagined a headline that misread the nuance, "You are God," and the chorus of misreadings that would follow. He felt a fierce, protective urge toward the integrity of the experience. The alien had shown him something delicate and difficult. It was not a bumper sticker. That night, before he sent anything to his publisher, he decided to return to the backyard where the encounter had begun. The plane trees leaned like old colleagues absorbing gossip. The hedgerow smelled faintly of wet earth. He sat on the same stone, feeling the ordinary cold of ordinary things, and spoke aloud, odd but a form of accountability, some of the images that had stayed with him. Ocean, vale, the theater of screens. There was no reply from the sky. There was only the ambient hum of the town, and a sense, newly firm, that whatever had been shown was not a secret to be hoarded, nor a doctrine to be drafted in haste, but an invitation to a different kind of attention.
As he stood to go inside, Alan noticed a faint impression lingering in his peripheral awareness, a sense that the ship's demonstration had more to offer, that the mechanics of the veiling and the social patterns of suppression had deeper strands yet to be traced. The alien had promised demonstration rather than assertion, and his curiosity now tugged toward the work of corroboration, to map the historical instances, to invite careful interlocutors,
to design practices that were ethically grounded and methodologically modest. He felt the gravity of the next step, to translate the interior event into a public inquiry that respected both skepticism and wonder. Inside his study, he opened the drawer where he kept certain loose papers, scribbled notes from years ago that had been abandoned for lack of traction. He pulled them out, a fragment from a dissertation on Meister Eckhart, a photocopy of a passage from the Gospel of Thomas, a note on Rupert Sheldrake's contested morphic resonance, an article on noetic research. Each felt like a node in a network now visible because of the ship's showing. He began to outline a plan, gather testimonies, cross-reference historical episodes of suppression and absorption, and design micro-practices for attention that would be offered not as cures but as experiments. The outline took shape into coherent chapters in his mind: experiential report, historical survey, scientific parallels, practical methods. But as the evening deepened, a new image entered his mind with the force of a command. The alien had not only shown him the process of veiling, it had also alluded, briefly and without words, to consequences that reached into ethics, politics, and personal responsibility. Recognition, once it becomes more than an intellectual assent, calls a person into different behaviors. For someone like Alan, who had spent his life translating experiences into texts, that implied a second careful conversion, to live in a way that his recognition informed his choices, not merely his rhetoric. He wrote one sentence before sleep claimed him: "The world, as created, may be the very act by which a singular consciousness delights in becoming many." He did not write it as a slogan. He wrote it as an observation that carried, beside its metaphysical curiosity, a moral implication. If the one experiments through the many, then compassion is not optional. He closed his notebook and lay awake, feeling the weight of a question that had shifted from theoretical to immediate. How does one live in the light of such recognition? Before a final rest, he resolved two practical things. First, he would collect corroborative testimony, mystical accounts, marginalized scriptures, and even the contemporary research that hinted at consciousness-first hypotheses.
Second, he would craft an accessible invitation for others to test the basic perceptual claim that a short, disciplined pause could reveal more about the membrane between self and world than hours of argument. He refused to promise miraculous outcomes. He would offer the experiment as an ethical and experiential opportunity. Morning arrived thin and determined. Alan sat by the window with tea and a growing sense that the account he was preparing could not be merely an intellectual release. The alien's demonstration had changed the axis of his life. It was not enough to report. He owed a faithful translation, a careful mapping between the inner showing and public discourse, honest about limits and humble about claims. He began to type the first lines of what he imagined would be a longer essay, the same lines that might later be converted into a talk or a series of seminars. He wanted the opening to carry the charge of the question and the gravity of his experience without collapsing into sensationalism. He wrote, at first, the simple rhetorical hook that had pulled him up on that night: "Who created the world?" and then immediately expanded the frame, listing the conventional answers as the reader might expect: God above, the Big Bang, intelligent designers, simulation theories, before inserting the experience that would reorient the list. An alien's demonstrating showing the world as an economy of a single consciousness, veiling itself into multiplicity. He paused. This was the point for a kind of practical invitation. If the question felt like an old lock, the alien's demonstration had offered a new key. But keys do not prove doors. They only open them for those willing to turn the handle. Alan added a single modest line for those watching or reading. If this narrative speaks to you, there is a resource in the pinned comment for a simple experiment of recognition. If you want to follow this kind of story and join the inquiry, hit subscribe. He wanted reach, but not spectacle. The line was a small act of distribution, not recruitment. He pressed send on an email to a trusted editor with a subject line carrying the bare facts and the caveat of humility. The reply came later that afternoon, a short note asking for discretion and expressing interest in a careful editorial path. That response both eased and tightened his chest. He was moving from private witness toward public responsibility, and every step had unforeseen hitches. As the week matured, Alan cycled through public and private moments, each refracted by the ship's demonstration. He taught, he wrote, he drank tea with colleagues. Yet beneath the rhythm of ordinary days, the images from the craft kept returning with increasing clarity. He found himself rehearsing the showing in his mind with the discipline of an experimenter, testing what stayed essential and what was poetic ornament. Then, after several days of steady, disciplined inquiry, an unexpected letter arrived at his door. An invitation from an interdisciplinary conference that had read an early anonymized draft.
They wanted him to speak on the role of first-person testimony in the study of consciousness. It was a small stage, but it suggested a possibility that careful testimony, when framed honestly and methodologically, could open conversations across disciplinary lines rather than provoke reflexive dismissal. He accepted. Preparing for that talk would be his first trial in translating the ship's demonstration into an accessible public discourse. To do it well, he would need evidence beyond his own recollection. He would need to set the demonstration beside historical testimony and scientific anomalies without making them look like components of a single ecclesiastical apparatus. He would have to preserve the alien's neutrality and avoid elevating it into a savior. Most importantly, he would need to remain committed to the principle the alien had emphasized: show, don't merely tell. The night before his presentation, Alan returned one more time to the backyard. The plane trees rustled as if they had been waiting. He breathed the cold air and felt the sequence of images settling into a new order in his chest. The ocean and the veil had become companions rather than metaphors. Ethical weight and personal humility sat side by side. He felt prepared, not certain. As he stood there, an impression arrived, soft, precise. The alien had given him a doorway into a larger conversation, but not an answer to all the difficult practical questions that followed. There were patterns to trace, histories to honor, practices to design. There were, above all, people to invite into experiments of attention that respected their freedom and their context. He thought of the students who would listen. He thought of the town that kept its ordinary hum. The night seemed to hold both the trivial and the sacred. He walked back inside and sat at his desk, pen poised above paper. The demonstration had opened a dynamic between inner recognition and outer responsibility, between private revealing and public translation. He was about to step into that work when the last image from the ship returned. Not a map, not a doctrine, but an invitation. To test recognition for oneself, with modesty and rigor, and to see what follows. He set the pen down and began to write his talk with that injunction in mind. Not to tell a world what it must believe, but to present an experiment simple enough for any attentive person to try, and to show how such small practices might lead to a rearrangement of moral concern. The work of corroboration and historical tracing would follow his talk, and after that, he felt the edge of the unknown. The deeper demonstrations the ship had hinted at might be shared.
For now, the task was clear. Present the showing with care, invite inquiry, and hold the space for both wonder and skepticism. He did not yet know how audiences would receive him. He did not yet know whether institutions would absorb or resist. What he did know, with a clarity that steadied rather than triumphed, was this: the Night of Light had not given a polished dogma. It had given a living gesture toward a possibility, an experiential claim that mirrored the reports of mystics, and that asked for recognition rather than assent. If the world had been created, the alien's showing suggested, it had been done not from outside, but from within, in a deliberate veiling that allowed the one to taste being as many. The moral weight of that possibility pressed down gently, like the sense one has when a responsibility, newly seen, becomes unavoidable. He folded his notes and, with a quiet breath, prepared to step toward the podium that would test the boundary between private revelation and public inquiry. The ship's images lay behind him like a landscape he could visit again. The work ahead was to translate that landscape into a language that would neither flatten its depth nor claim it as dogma for others. As he shut off the lamp and the study dimmed into ordinary night, the last impression that lingered was not an answer, but a prompt. Recognition must be lived, not merely asserted. The morning of the conference arrived with a thin, undecided rain that blurred the edges of the city like an apology. Alan walked into the hall carrying more than slides and handouts. He carried the ship's showing folded in the habit of his bones. He carried the weight of names: Eckhart, Al-Hallaj, St. John. He carried the humility of a man who had learned the difference between telling and inviting. When he took the podium, the room was a tidy cross-section of interests: philosophers in navy blazers, a few journalists with the look of people surfing for a story, a smattering of students who had watched his seminar and those who had not. He began not with spectacle, but with a claim so modest it almost read as pedagogical, that first-person testimony has a place beside third-person data when we study consciousness. He sketched the familiar options: materialist reductionism, theistic creation narratives, designer hypotheses, and then, gently, introduced the night that had reorganized his thinking. He spoke in the measured cadence of someone who knows the power and limits of words, describing a telepathic demonstration, the ocean and the veil, the felt collapse of subject-object division.
He did not try to force the audience to the site. He asked them instead to consider correlation. The same pattern recurs in scribes and sages across time, and a single event had shown that what those teachers reported could be a description of a mechanism, fragmentation for the sake of discovery. A few reporters in the second row glanced at one another, pencils poised like compasses.
A woman near the aisle, a cognitive neuroscientist whose name he would later remember, Dr. Miriam Klein, raised a soft hand and asked the question everyone wanted to frame with sharper teeth. How could such an interior event be verified? Alan's answer was the heart of his translation project. He said verification was not a simple matter of measuring an object's mass. There were methodological moves that could be made: controlled first-person protocols, phenomenological triangulation, careful replication of practices that produced shifts in reportable experience, and there were limits. He described ongoing research that had taken first-person reports seriously without making them into metaphysics, naming institutions with cautious respect, a small but increasing corpus of noetic studies, careful phenomenologists, tentative dialogues in certain physics circles about the role of consciousness. He cited Rupert Sheldrake as a figure whose proposals, contested as they were, had nevertheless opened conversations about unseen regularities in nature that materialist orthodoxy had sometimes dismissed too quickly. He emphasized that these names were not proofs of the ship's demonstration. They were context markers that showed the field was not monolithic. After the talk, the questions swelled into a practical row of concerns: the ethics of disclosure, the risk of cultish absorption, the hazard that mystical language would be misappropriated by the Internet's appetite for slogan. Alan answered each with the humility of a scholar who knows how institutions breathe. He said institutions do not always conspire to hide. They often react to differences by defaulting to self-preserving moves, recasting anomalies into manageable categories, warning against reputational risk, and so on. Systems have homeostasis, he told them. That is not villainy, it's structure. It takes intentional, careful translation to change those dynamics. The reaction was predictably mixed. A few viewers left the hall with expressionless curiosity. Others felt their skepticism sharpened into disbelief. Nevertheless, something subtle began. A colleague sent an email proposing a small pilot study exploring first-person reports after a guided pause exercise. A journalist wrote a piece that, in its first draft, traded nuance for headline, but later, after conversations with Alan, chose a more careful angle. A handful of students in the graduate seminar asked whether they could meet privately to try the simple practices he had mentioned: a 2-minute pause, a recognition exercise, and a nightly gratitude noting. That group became, in short order, a laboratory of lived experiments. Alan taught the practices as experiments, not panaceas. The pause was presented as a method. Stop the habitual forward thrust of attention for 2 minutes. Feel whatever is there without quick story. Note the felt boundary that ordinarily separates I from other.
Recognition was framed as an attention shift. When you meet another person, friend, stranger, adversary, try briefly to feel them as a locus of experience, not merely as an object. Gratitude was proposed not as magical thanks, but as a reflective inventory of what remains robust under stress. Their reports were ordinary and human. One student said the pause revealed an unexpected softness when listening to a friend. Another described a moment of embarrassment when the recognition practice surfaced their impatience rather than compassion. One graduate noted a slight alteration in the way she prepared for class, less agenda-driven, more attentive to students' expressions. None of these were proclamations of enlightenment. They were micro-notes in a ledger of experience. Alan used them in talks, not as evidence for the cosmic claim, but as demonstration of how small attentional disciplines could make the membrane between self and world more visible. Word spread, which produced both blessing and burden. A mainstream outlet published an article that leaned into the more sensational angle. Scholar says alien showed him you are God, and the distortion stung. Alan found himself rehearsing cautions he had already written down. Mystics' claims are descriptions of experience, not imperial doctrines. To say the one is manifest in many is an interpretive option, not an erasure of responsibility. He wrote correction notes to editors, requested clarifications, and at one point considered retreat. The alien, its neutrality intact, had shown it had not promised that the world would listen kindly to the demonstration. Not all responses were reductionist. A quiet lineage of scholars reached out: comparative religionists, phenomenologists, a physicist studying consciousness-adjacent anomalies, inviting dialogue. An interdisciplinary team from a small research institute proposed a collaboration to design a structured protocol that combined phenomenological interviews, psychological measures, carefully chosen, and narrative reports in order to explore shifts in first-person experience following attentional practice. Alan agreed with caveats. He wanted the methodology to honor the lived texture of the material, not to flatten it into a psychometric checklist. Institutional caution continued to appear, not as villainy, but as system-preserving reflex. His department chair politely warned about reputational risk. His publisher asked for measured framing that would avoid the trappings of sensationalism. He accepted those constraints. They forced him to sharpen his language, speak as witness, bracket claims, invite test rather than demand assent. The alien showing had given him courage, not certitude.
As months passed, Alan's project unfolded in 3 intertwined strands: public talks that sought to be careful, a small collaborative research protocol, and a practical booklet that outlined the 3 basic practices with precise instructions for those willing to try them at home. He insisted on low-claim language in that booklet. "Try this as an experiment," read the header. "Notice without believing. Report without expecting. Be kind to yourself in the failure to notice." The booklet's reception was revealing. For some, it was a small gift, an accessible invitation into attention. For others, it became a symbol of a larger thing they feared, the flattening of sacred language into self-help. A conservative theologian asked for a meeting to discuss how mystical discourse could be misread in ways that harm communal faith. Alan welcomed the conversation. They sat across from each other in the university tea room and talked not as adversaries but as people trying to parse shared texts with different priorities. The theologian, a woman who had spent decades in pastoral care, said plainly, "Mystical language is dangerous if it promises self-sufficiency. It can become justification for ignoring real obligations." Alan agreed and emphasized the alien's ethical force. Recognition tends towards responsibility, not away from it. Their exchange was candid and, for Alan, necessary, an antidote to any drift toward spectacle. There were nights when doubt returned with the persistence of tide. Old reflexes, ambition, the lure of being the voice of a movement, the temptation to smooth complexities into pithy claims, pulled at him. He found himself scanning messages for praise or derision, and occasionally caught the small animal of ego checking whether the ship's demonstration had elevated him. The alien's image, neutral and unsentimental, came back to him then as the right corrective. The being had not sought disciples, it had shown. Alan learned to treat his agitation as data. Where the ego sought validation, practice should cultivate steadiness. The students' group, now 2 semesters old, began producing accounts that felt less like isolated testimonials and more like a communal artifact. One member, a young woman named Priya, reported that a recognition practice after a difficult family call made her response gentler. She later apologized in a tone she said surprised even her. Another, a neuroscience student, told Alan she felt a narrowing of the reflex to quantify every internal shift as data. She could be in an experience without turning it into a graph. These reports were not proof of metaphysics. They were structural signs that attention could be retrained in ways that altered moral comportment. Meanwhile, the collaborative study yielded measurable internal shifts in report style. Participants used fewer absolutist terms and more relational language when describing social encounters.
The team was careful to emphasize limitations, small sample, lab context, possible selection bias, but the trends suggested that simple practices could change the framing people use to talk about others. Alan used that outcome cautiously when conversing with journalists. It was the kind of evidence he had hoped for: modest, replicable, ethically charged. As public curiosity rose, so did the danger of misappropriation. An online forum emerged where clips from his talk were stripped of nuance and repurposed as bumper sticker declarations. Alan watched examples of the aliens showing retooled into simplistic mantras. He addressed the problem directly in a webinar. Language from a living event cannot be made into a dogma without losing its power. He urged those who watched clips to return to the practices rather than to the slogans. "If you want to know," he said, "try noticing. Noticing has teeth. Slogans have only echoes." Then, 8 months after the night in the backyard, something unexpected happened. A small, unannounced letter arrived at his desk from an unexpected source, an archivist in a monastery remote enough that internet rumors traveled slowly. She had read a short, anonymized summary of his talk and written to offer access to a codex fragment she thought might interest him, a marginal gloss that suggested a medieval mystic had used language unusually consonant with the mechanics of forgetting he had described. Alan was surprised and pleased. The fragment's language did not prove the ship's demonstration, but it fit the pattern he had been tracing across centuries. He felt the familiar thrill of a breadcrumb appearing where the map had been thin.
That year, he was invited to a small, mixed convening of scholars and practitioners who wanted to explore the pragmatic consequences of a non-dual perception for ethics and civic life. The convening was a careful affair, with theologians, ethicists, a jurist, a few community organizers, and Allen among them. The debate that unfolded was not about cosmology, but about action. How does a recognition of shared ground translate into law, justice, and everyday duty? Participants wrestled with the tension between metaphysical claims and practical accountability. A human rights lawyer warned against metaphysical readings that could be misused to justify passivity toward injustice. An organizer spoke of how empathy practices had changed coalition conversations in a city program. The group left with no tidy answers, but with a shared conviction that knowledge without practice is shallow, and practice without political imagination can be toothless. Allen's role shifted in small ways. He was no longer merely the man who had been shown something unusual. He had become a translator, convener, and sometimes a cautious public interlocutor. He was invited to speak at community centers, small churches, and secular forums, always careful to keep the line between testimony and doctrine clear.
He edited the booklet into an e-book and placed it in the pinned comment of an online talk, a practical resource, not a manifesto. The alien did not return in the shape of starry rescue narratives. It showed up subtly, 3 times over the next year, as if reminding him that demonstration, not decoration, was the point. The visits were brief and unostentatious, a soft impression in the backyard, a corridor of images when he sat at his desk, a sudden clarity about a passage in a marginal text. Each time, the alien's communication was the same in tone, neutral, precise, and encouraging of further, careful inquiry. None of the visits tempted him to build a cult of the space between his years. They felt like checkpoints set by a teacher who refuses to become the center of the story. Resistance persisted in other forms. A caricatured article splashed his name across social media in a way that made colleagues wince. A small but vocal online community insisted the discovery warranted immediate, total conversion. Allen distanced himself from that fervor. He became adept at recurring statements. Test the practices, hold the ethics, remain skeptical of those who sell certainty. He repeated them in interviews with growing steadiness. The practical work continued to ripple outward. A community center that had invited Allen for a talk implemented the 3 practices at the start of meetings. The coordinator reported that conflicts de-escalated with surprising speed. She described the shift not as miraculous, but as the consequence of a small cultural reset. A hospital chaplain tried the pause practice in bereavement counseling and reported that some families found it a stabilizing presence. Each report was anecdotal. None were used to promise universal outcomes. Allen insisted on that restraint. In private, the inner dynamic between Allen's doubt and his commitment refined into a kind of disciplined skepticism. He started to chart his own inner life more deliberately, moments when recognition arose naturally, and the times it did not. He kept a log not as proof, but as humility, a record showing the unevenness of human hearts. He taught students to treat their failures of attention as data rather than proof of spiritual inadequacy. One afternoon, a former student who had emigrated to another country wrote to say that the practices had influenced a difficult conversation with a sibling. Another student, now teaching in an urban school, sent a short video where she modeled a 2-minute pause with 4th graders before a reading exercise, an experiment so simple and so human that Allen found himself moved. These small proofs mattered to him more than headlines. As his public profile grew modestly, so did the pull toward institutionalization. A private foundation proposed that he developed a curriculum. A publisher offered a book deal conditioned on a tidy narrative arc. An influencer offered to produce a series with click-friendly segments.
Each offer carried the risk of flattening the delicate material into merchandised simplicity. Allen learned to say no with increasing clarity. He negotiated conditions. Any curriculum must foreground the methodology of test and report. Any media project must retain the essential ambiguity that a demonstration entails. He was protective not of prestige, but of fidelity. The ethic that had surfaced in the alien showing became for him the crucial test of authenticity. Recognition without action, he found, produces a strange cognitive dissonance. Seeing unity and then choosing indifference felt like a betrayal. Thus, he increasingly wove care into his public life. Letters to colleagues in crisis, small donations to support student projects that encouraged cross-disciplinary work, and, when invited, testimony before civic groups about how attention practices might be incorporated into restorative justice without erasing accountability. The question from the title, "Who Created the World?" had moved in Allen's public framing from a metaphysical knot to a living prompt. He no longer used the phrase as a riddle to be solved, but as an invitation to experiment.
The answer the alien had offered, creation as a fragmentation of one consciousness into many perspectives, remained a profound option, one that fits snugly with a long lineage of mystical reports. He never claimed it as the only reading. Rather, he insisted it was a coherent map that made certain ethical consequences visible. If the one experiences itself as many, then harm is never merely external. It is a wound within the same field. This claim produced both beauty and difficulty. On the one hand, people described increased tenderness in ordinary encounters. On the other, political violence and systemic injustice continued regardless of metaphysical frameworks. Allen confronted the hard, unavoidable truth that recognition does not automatically dismantle structures of oppression. It can be a motivator for compassionate action, but it cannot replace organized strategic effort. He began to speak more often about the intersection of inner work and public work. The practices invite a change in perception. Structural transformation demands organized strategic effort. Over time, a cautious community of practitioners and scholars coalesced around the edges of Allen's work, people who refused both the smug certainties of dogma and the blank skepticism of hardline materialists. They convened workshops, published a small special issue in a peer-reviewed journal that treated first-person protocols seriously, and curated a database of marginalized mystical texts for comparative study. The project remained intentionally modest, slow, interdisciplinary, self-critical. Then, in a lecture hall oddly reminiscent of one where he had first told his story, Allen offered the talk he had promised himself he would, not a manifesto, but a model for inquiry.
He recounted the Night of Light, outlined the historical correspondences, and demonstrated the 3 practices with live participants. He invited the audience to try a 2-minute pause in the room. The hum of breathing and restrained attention was palpably different. He asked them to notice with clinical humility what shifted in your speech, in your bodily stance. No one claimed revelation. Several people said later that something had moved in them toward listening. He closed by reframing the initial question with the quiet inversion that had altered the course of his life. If the world was created, perhaps it was created from within, a one apprenticing itself in multiplicity to taste existence. The implication was not metaphysical escape, but ethical demand. If you sense, even for a moment, that separation is less absolute than you thought, he said, the moral response is plain. Treat that otherness with care. At the end of the evening, he paused and offered a final practical invitation, a small e-book distilling the practices, and a modest program for those who wanted to test recognition with community support. He asked only that participants approach the work with honesty and restraint, not promising enlightenment, only an experiment in attention that could, for some, rearrange how one meets the world. For those who wished to support the continuation of careful inquiry and modest public work, he mentioned a membership option that would fund research and community programs. The invitation was concrete and uncluttered. Resources in the pinned comment, and one way to help keep the research independent. Walking home beneath a sky that had no neon to compete with memory, Allen thought of the ocean image that had greeted him inside the ship. The metaphor had gained new edges. The oceanic image no longer served as a romantic refuge. It had become a practical metaphor for how recognition demands responsibility. If the waves are the ocean, a wave that injures another wave still injures the whole. That ethical inflection kept him humble and urgent. Months later, a small but robust dossier had formed. The e-book circulated in quiet circles. The research team published cautiously optimistic findings about attention shifts. The community organizers reported micro-changes in meeting dynamics, and the scholarly special issue provoked respectful debate. None of these amounted to a wholesale revolution. Change evolves in accumulations, not in viral explosions. Allen accepted that. He kept returning to his backyard at night, to the stone bench under the plane trees, to listen for the soft interior hum that had first asked him to be present. In private conversation, he sometimes described the alien as a neutral validator, a being who had the capacity to show something and no interest in being worshipped. That description kept the being in the role it had taken, a teacher, not a messiah.
He also reminded listeners that the alien's showing was an experiential claim nested among many such claims across history. It tilted understanding. It did not abolish ambiguity. When confronted with the most difficult ethical tests, how to speak about perpetrators, how to engage with suffering, how to avoid spiritual bypassing, Allen was direct. Recognition of unity is not an exculpation for wrongdoing. Responsibility remains. To say the one experiences itself as many does not abolish moral law, it recontextualizes it. He insisted that recognition should produce accountability, not absolution. He pressed that idea with disciplinary rigor at panels and in conversations with restorative justice groups. The work, he insisted, was not metaphysical consolation, but ethical mobilization. The title question, Who Created the World, kept its power because it forced a choice about orientation, toward separation or toward connectedness. The aliens' demonstration suggested that the world emerges from a single ground that veils itself to become many, but the point for Alan was never to insist that everyone accept that reading. The point was to offer a demonstration and a small set of practices so that anyone could test the basic perceptual claim for themselves. If you sit and pause with attention, if you practice the recognition of another as a locus of experience, if you close the day with simple gratitude for what you encountered, you will not necessarily become enlightened. Many will report nothing striking. Some will note subtle shifts. A few may undergo experiences that reframe their lives. That variety of outcomes is exactly why Alan insisted on methodological modesty and ethical seriousness. In the end, the closure of his public work was not a proclamation, but an invitation. He asked people to test, rigorously, skeptically, kindly. He invited institutions to open small doors, first-person protocols, careful phenomenology, ethical reflexivity. He urged practitioners to resist the flattening of experience into slogans, and he asked that if recognition occurred, it be translated into action, care for bodies, attention to structures, efforts to repair harm. So, answering the title's provocation with respect for nuance, the alien told him, in a showing that reframed his life, that the world might not have been created by an external other, but rather is an expression, a deliberate fragmentation, of a single field of consciousness tasting itself. That explanation defied his previous intellectual categories, as the title promises, but even that defiance was not the final point. The real test, the alien seemed to insist through its demonstration, was whether recognition would alter how one treated the next person one met. If you want to see for yourself, there is a resource in the pinned comment, a short ebook with the 3 practices and instructions for a cautious group experiment.
If this inquiry matters to you, and you wish to support careful research and community programs that explore first-person testimony responsibly, consider joining the modest membership that funds independent study and public resources. If nothing else, try the 2-minute pause this week and notice what it does to your speech and to your willingness to listen. Who created the world? The answer the alien showed Alan is not a neat label, but an opening. The world as the one learning itself through countless voices. That insight, if it lands at all, carries not relief but obligation. Recognition requires responsibility. Seeing unity calls for compassion. Test it. If the evidence of your attention shifts, let your actions follow the evidence. If not, keep questioning. Either way, the invitation remains. Do the experiment, keep your ethics, and let the discovery be lived rather than merely adored.